walk in, you're going to get a piece of paper where you're basically going to write the answers. At 9:30, simultaneously, Erica is going to email to everybody the data file. And just in case your email doesn't work, it's also going to appear on the Canvas page. I'm just going to put you where, but she'll put it up somewhere. And then you've got your 40 minutes to do the exam. It's all, almost all of it is compute a number with Excel and then just write the number in. There's just like one or two little, what kind of problem is this concept pieces. At the end of the exam, before you leave, email me your workbook. That is stated on here. That's so, you know, there's some issues or some potential for partial credit. We can see what you were doing. What I did not write on the cover sheet is I would like you to use a very specific file format because I'm going to have 100 of these in my inbox and I want to be able to sort them and make it test2, then your last name, comma, your first name. And that just means I'll be able to find them as I'm searching for them. And what's also not here is email them to both me and to Erica. Any questions about the exam? Yeah.
Are these going to be mostly like transshipment problems? Because in the previous exams, there were like data table questions and like a product mix question.
It's cumulative exam. You won't be surprised. I'm going to emphasize the material since the last exam, which is not only chapter 5, but also chapter 4. So there will be a sensitivity analysis kind of question also. What's cumulative though is stuff like that sensitivity analysis question's got to be about something. So it could be about a make versus buy, it could be an allocation or whatever. And by the way, when it gets to the final exam, that's cumulative. There will be review questions from the whole course, but I try to set it up so it's about double proportionately material from chapters 6 and 7 on that last test. So every one of the chapters contributes equal weight to the course grade at the end. All good? All right, substantive questions. Yep.
Professor, can you have comma in the filing?
Didn't hear you.
Can you have a comma in the filing?
This is the subject header of the email.
Okay.
Did I say file name? If I did, I apologize. Not a bad thing to have your last name in the file also, but what I'm really focused on is my email inbox is going to have 100 emails plus 7 others that are going to come in at the same time, and I want to be able to sort them so that I can find it. But yeah, I mean, you can leave it as a space. The most important thing is to start it with test 2 and then the last name so it alphabetizes. Substantive questions? All right, today is actually kind of a fun day. We got to finish up this equity end of chapter problem, but then most of the rest of today we get to do cases, which are richer than end of chapter problems for managerial interpretation. Before we get into that, quick reminder and review. If I say product mix, you immediately think Howie. If I say employee scheduling, you immediately think Snookers. So, and what are Snookers types problems? They are instances in which the number of staff you need to have working at any point in time varies over time, and you're trying to find the least costly way to meet that variable demand for your ability to deliver services, where the decision variables are the number of people who are assigned to each shift, where the shift includes not only what it means in conventional English, i.e. hours of the day you work, but also what days of the week you work. So if you know your shift, you know exactly when you're working and not working. And that is essential because you, the modeler, are going to construct a yellow box like this full of zeros and ones indicating is somebody who is hired to work that shift on duty in that time slot. And The objective function is the minimize cost, and the constraints in the classic problem are just number of people working at any given time greater or equal to the number that you need. When that's all it is, the LP relaxation will often return an integer solution. But when you start to add whistles and bells, like in the Snookers problem, that during the peak times, a certain percentage of the workers must be full-time workers, then you need the integrality requirement to avoid having bloody torsos working for you. The important distinction between employee scheduling and the assignment problem is the assignment problem recognizes the distinctive individual characteristics of each person. So it says Mary will do task 3, and assigning Mary to do task 3 generates a different value in the objective function coefficient than having Sam do task 3. Here, it's not like that. We just have a pool of staff, and it's how many of them are doing each of these different things. All right, capital budgeting is essentially any pure binary problem, but it is modeling situations where there are go, no-go decisions being made about a large number of potential projects or activities. Like a year from now in your capstone, you'll have 50 great ideas for things you could do for the client, but you won't have time to do them all. And they all are sort of, you got to do it or not do it. You can't have to these things. If there's only one constraint, that's the special case of a knapsack problem, but in general, there will be more than one constraint. In the classic problem that gives the problem type its name, the different constraints correspond to different points in time, because when you're making a capital investment decision like building a building, that has cost implications not only right now, but in different time periods into the future. And the textbooks problem is really very good for that. But we still call it a capital budgeting problem, even when those multiple constraints don't pertain to money in different points in time. The one that we did in class was the video game developer problem, and there the constraints were one was money, but the other one was number of programmers. You had 20 programmers available. Set covering problems come from the facility location literature. You're making yes, no, go, no go decisions about whether to build a facility at any of a number of candidate sites. Or sometimes you'll see problems that are like pre-position ambulances. So the go, no go is have an ambulance parked at this intersection waiting for a 911 call. So sometimes you're not literally building a building, but a very common situation is building facilities. We call them set covering problems because we are trying to cover the needs of customers or citizens who live in different places, and the constraints come from those customers. There are several different flavors. The one that we did, what's the least costly way of covering everybody? And then the constraints will be for every group of people, say for every neighborhood, the number of facilities that are close enough to them to make them happy must be greater than or equal to classically 1, but more generally, however many facilities they demand to have be close enough to help them. And that was just a min cost sort of formulation. There are other flavors, such as we've only got 3 facilities, we can't cover everyone. What's the most people that we can cover with 3 facilities? And then you're actually making 2 sets of decisions, yes, no, build or don't build at each of the different sites. But you're also effectively making yes, no, I will or will not cover the people in each of the different regions. So then you need 2 vectors of binary variables. You need not only the yes, no for all the build sites, you also are going to have a blue cell for each set of residents saying yes, no, I did or did not cover them or take care of them. When the problem is you must cover everybody, then you don't need that second vector of blue because everybody is going to be covered. So the set covering problems come in multiple flavors. They're all just exactly like the one we did. Fourth category here, the textbook says are line balancing problems, meaning assembly lines in a factory. I don't think they're that useful, so I de-emphasize reading that section of the book. But you can think of line balancing as just a special case of creating equity or balance in general. And those are very common. They'll come up a lot in public policy, social justice kinds of settings, but the textbook problems are going to be for profit because, as I indicated to you at the beginning of the course, there are like 25 times more MBA students than there are folks like you. So Ragsdale's no dummy. He wrote the examples for the biggest part of the market, but mathematics are the same. If you learn how to do this, you can do it in your own problem domains. The problem that we got most of the way through on Tuesday was we have 10 customers that need to be assigned to 5 salespeople, and the assignments are yes, no. That customer is with that salesperson and not with any other. There's no sharing. There's no 2 salespeople assigned to any one of the customers. And the basic structure of the problem here is like a transportation problem, because there's double subscript Xij, but now it's Xij equals 1 if customer I is assigned to salesperson J and 0 otherwise. And that, by the way, is a common way to define binary decision variables. So you can say let Xij be a binary decision variable such that, but it's also common to do this little open left bracket thing, 1, 0, what 1 stands for and what 0 stands for. Everybody okay with the decision variables? In a transportation problem, we will sum down the column and also sum across the row. We do sum down the column here, and summing down the column says how many salespeople is that customer assigned to? For instance, if we had a solution that looked like this, that would say customer number 1 is assigned to all 5 salespeople. We don't want that. So when we sum down the column, we're just going to force those to be equal to 1. When we go across the row, we're not really interested in the simple number of customers that each salesperson gets. We're interested in the sales potential that salesperson gets, or a weighted sum of the number of people. In a quick aside, lots of times when you're seeing problems in textbooks that are less applied, you'll hear about it as rocks and bags of rocks. So it'll be expressed as you've got a pile of rocks of different weight, you've got a bunch of bags, in this case 5 bags. How do you put the rocks in the bags so the bags end up being as close to equal weight as possible? Ragsdale is pretty good, I think, at creating these end of chapter problems that are small, so they fit on a screen, but they help you directly see what the application in the real world is. Many management science textbooks are more mathy, in the sense that the problem at the end of the chapter will be, we want to put rocks in bags. And it's the same problem, but Ragsdale helps you see the bridge to the real world, but I'm giving you a heads up. These are very often called rocks and bags problems as well. All right, that's the problem. How do we get this thing into solver with an objective function? The important insight is we are not trying to maximize the company's sales potential, because that is fixed. All 10 of these customers are going to have a salesperson assigned to them. All the rocks are gonna go in one bag or another. What we're interested in is minimizing the inequity across the bags. And the trick, or a trick for doing this, is to introduce these undershoot and overshoot variables. One of the reasons I'm very pleased that we have this chance to talk about this problem is undershoot and overshoot variables are absolutely core to next week's topic of multiple objectives. In this section, did we talk about what these undershoot and overshoot variables are? I think we didn't, right? I think it was the other section that was a little farther ahead. So here's the way to think about this. Column L is what you get. That's the weight of the rocks in the bag. And we're going to compare that to a target. And the target in this particular problem is 210. Also, don't remember whether or not I explained why 210 in this class, did I? It's just add up all the sales potential across all of the customers, divide by 5, because we have 5 salespeople. So if all 5 salespeople received sales potential of 210, that'd be perfect. That'd be exactly ideal. So that's my target. But any given set of Xij is going to produce actuals that deviate away from that ideal. How much do they deviate? Well, they deviate by an undershoot, meaning an amount you're under, and an overshoot. Or not both. It'll be one or the other, but we allow for both of those. So the left-hand side, that column O, is this expression. And inside solver, I'm going to add a constraint that says column O must equal 210. When I do that, Excel will use the flexibility I permit it by making those cells blue to fill in the numbers that will satisfy the constraint. So it will say, oh, for this set of X's, that number is 216. That's over by 6. So it will fill in 0 and 6 so that this is equal to 210. This is under by 17, so it will fill in that blue. To make this work, it's under by 35. This one is under by 30. This one is over by 76. So the main thing it's going to do is try out different X vectors to find what X vector is best. But because of the constraint that says all of these must equal 210, it's going to be forced to constantly fill in those under and over variables to capture the underage and the overage. And then the objective is just minimize that underage and overage. That gives Excel an incentive to play around with the X's, play around with the decisions about which rocks go in which bags, to find the solution, the X's, that minimizes the total of the underage and the overage. Does that make sense? Anybody want to ask questions about that?
So the only reason why we're not keeping the objective function as maximizing average is so that every row kind of, like, how do I explain this? Like if we put average as the objective function, then it would increase one of the values and that would increase the average, like in total. But by minimizing underage and overage, you make sure each row is closer to the average.
Right. My goal is to make each row close to the average. If I just tried to maximize the average subject to the constraint that the sum down the columns are all 1, Solver would say, I can't do anything to make your life better. No matter what I do that meets that constraint, the total will always be exactly 1,050. So the averages will always be exactly 210. I don't have any ability to create greater happiness for you.
Is the only objective function we can do to like minimize the addition of these, or can we like?
No, there's a lot of others. You want to learn more? Come back next week. Yeah, no, next week, we're going to talk about some other ways, like you can do this in percentage terms, and there's even a mini max approach that you'll learn about next week. So like I guess, either like this, you got to do this. And in fact, you pretty much got to do that. You know, you have to have those under and over cells, but then how you create the objective function to put downward pressure on them, there's actually a variety of particular forms that objective function can take. All right, I'll ask one more time. Everybody cool with that objective function? Okay. If computers, if the branch and bound algorithm were as convenient to use as a simplex algorithm, I just point solver at that, hit return, and instantly we'd have a perfect solution. But branch and bound needs more help from us than simplex did. It's hard to solve these integer programming problems, and sometimes we have to do some extra stuff just to help out the computer. Here's the challenge that the computer would face with that objective. It's subtle, and it has to do with that tolerance parameter. The tolerance parameter is a percentage. It's by what percentage are we willing to accept things that are not totally optimal. If the Z values are always hanging out around 2000, like suppose over the course of the run, they start at 2000 and they get brought down to 1800, and my tolerance is 10%, my actual size of tolerance started out at 200, 10% of 2000 is 200, and over the course of the run, my tolerance shrank a little bit, but only down to 180, which is still ballpark the same. So I'm giving roughly the same amount of tolerance. But here we have an objective function that we hope to drive to 0. So if things are going well, as the computer makes progress, the Z is going to start to get to be really small. And no matter what percentage I pick, any percentage of something that's nearly 0 is still really, really small. And so what will happen is exactly as solver is making progress, we are de facto going to become more and more anal, uptight, and OCD driven, and less that laid back surfer dude. So to avoid that problem, we just pump up the objective function by adding a positive constant to it. So now we're not driving it down to 0, we're driving it down to that arbitrary constant. And that will help out solver. All right, we are ready to go. Do you remember at the beginning of Tuesday's class, we looked at that graph, and then there was these strange words right next to it that said, it is helpful to the computer to start with blue cells that are feasible and pretty good. I've just done that. The blue cells right now are satisfying all the constraints I'm going to type in, because every customer is assigned to exactly one salesperson, and I've manually filled in those blue cells to make all of these left-hand sides equal 210. So this is a better place to start than if I'd left all those zeros. If I'd left all those zeros, the initial solution would not be feasible, so solver would not be able to start bounding right from the start. I didn't exert an enormous amount of effort trying to choose the best values of the X's. I could have tried harder. I could have, for instance, said, well, let me notice that customers 4 and 5 are the worst and the best customers. So let me give both of them to the same salesperson. And had this problem been much bigger, I might have wanted to do some of that sort of common sense reasoning ahead of time so that I could hopefully start with something better than this. This is not that big a problem, so I think we'll be fine. But that's what it means to start with blue cells that are feasible and pretty good. All right, let's get into Solver. We are going to minimize this by choosing the best values for where to put the rocks, comma, the under and over. The rocks, those are binary. Every customer has to be assigned to exactly one salesperson. If I don't do that, Solver is going to try to break the rocks in half. I need to make sure, oops, did I just mess that up? Yeah, that's okay. Every customer must be assigned to a salesperson. And all of these left-hand sides are going to be forced to be equal to 210. And I don't think this has come up before yet in the class, but if you highlight 5 cells on the left and only 1 cell on the right, Solver is smart enough to understand that's 5 separate constraints. It interprets it as the first thing on the left equals the thing on the right, and the second thing on the left equals the thing on the right on down. At least as of last year, you couldn't do it the other way around. If you had 1 cell equal to a set of cells on the other side of the comparator, it didn't understand that. But it can do multiple on the left, all equal to 1 on the right. I'm trying this with a 1% tolerance, see how it goes. It is working. So you can see this is not solving instantly. And it says, I found a solution, all constraints and optimality conditions are satisfied. And this is clearly a better solution than before. I don't remember what it was, 64.
1683 or something.
Yeah, all right. So this is way better. And you can guys see this is pretty darn good. Now that I have this as a really good initial solution, I can go ahead and shrink that tolerance down to 0 and run it again. And I don't remember right now whether or not there is any solution better than 20 as the total amount of underage and overage. And the answer is apparently not. So it came back saying, this is the best we're going to do. And that's it. And it's pretty good. You know, nobody is more than 212. Nobody's more than 218. Nobody's less than 204. That's pretty good. Questions about this problem?
So those actual values will be given to us like in the problem.
Which actual values? What cells do you have? Oh, I'm sorry, I don't have the right thing projecting. What actual values do you have in mind?
In column L.
Column L. Those are computed. They're just like the left-hand side of going all the way back to Howie.
Okay.
Yeah, they are computed. They're functions of the decision variables. What's given to you is row 5. You know what each of the rocks were.
Okay.
What's the arbitrary constant? 100?
You mean, what is its reason for existing and
Yeah.
purpose, or why did I choose 100?
Both.
So the reason it exists is if it's not there, then the Z value is going to be driven down to a pretty low value. Like, well, right now, you can see, had the 100 not been there, then my objective function value would have gotten all the way down to 20. It's saying I need to be plus or minus 1% of 20. is saying plus or minus 0.2. But the rocks all have weights that are integers. So that is identical to saying, I insist on total absolute optimality.
So zero tolerance. I mean, if we didn't
Yeah, I
have it,
mean, there's so like, you can't get around having de facto zero tolerance.
Yeah.
But if I add the 100 to it, then if I have, say, 5% tolerance, I'm saying anything plus or minus 5 or 6, that's cool. So the adding the constant prevents progress towards optimality from accidentally reducing your effective tolerance. Why 100? Because it worked.
yeah,
This one you can reason about a little bit though, because you know it's going to be multiplied by the tolerance thing. So 100 is not a crazy kind of number for this purpose. All right, any questions about the broader concept of equity balancing? The basic strategy in equity balancing is, it's up on the board. You create constraints that are what you get plus undershoot minus overshoot equal to the target, and then minimize the undershoot and the overshoot. And that exact same trick we'll use next week for a different purpose. Next week, we'll use that to allow us to simultaneously consider multiple objectives. Like we want to maximize profit and minimize pollution. And the best way to do that uses the same undershoot overshoot. Very glad that's happening right now when I paused anyhow. I wanted the doors closed so I didn't bother anybody else. Maybe works both ways. Okay, so let's talk about the lockbox problem that hopefully you read. What's going on in the lockbox problem? Who's the decision maker? What are they deciding? And what are the multiple considerations that are being balanced in this optimization? Who's the decision maker? That's not hard in the master debt lockbox problem. It's MasterCard, basically. So this is a credit card company. What are they deciding? First of all, what is a lockbox?
It's something that they use to help them increase their cash flow. So they're not waiting for checks that are taking a long time to send in the mail. It's like a place they can go to like liquidate the check, if I'm understanding it.
Yeah, basically. I mean, liquidate's not quite the right verb,
Or, yeah.
but yes, one of the considerations they're dealing with is float, meaning from the time the check is put in the mail by the customer paying their credit card bill until it arrives, that's wasted capital. They would rather get that check deposited faster. It's bad news for them if a customer in Maine mails the check to San Diego, because then the Postal Service has that check for a week and nobody's gaining interest on that float or that money that's in the mail. And lockboxes are a way of reducing that so that the customer can mail the check to a lockbox that's relatively nearby. And so those are basically the two considerations. We want to minimize float, that lost opportunity cost of capital, the lost interest, if you will, on that money. Although because they're a company, it's not interest, it's the opportunity cost of capital. And then the other side is the lockboxes cost money. So if lockboxes were free, then we'd use 6,000 lockboxes at every single street corner. And if lockboxes cost $1 billion a second, we wouldn't use many of them, but we're balancing those two kinds of costs. That's the nature of the problem. But what is the lockbox? I mean, it sounds like this piece of metal that you put a key into, and that might have been what it was 150 years ago, but that's not what it is now. What actually is a lockbox? This is not in the words. This is, you need to have common sense about how the world operates.
Is it an electronic scanner that scans the check immediately and maybe the banks could use it?
So yes, it is, to fill in some words, it is an automated and efficient way of depositing the check. And that includes like probably an automated way of opening up the envelope, pulling out that check, scanning it, and crediting master debts. So yeah, it's an automated, efficient way of opening up envelopes and depositing checks. Who owns that thing? The local gas station, is the US federal government? Who owns that? Who does that? A bank. That's the key idea. How many checks does a credit card company process per year? I don't know, 10 million or something like that. Not a very large number. How many checks does a bank process? I have no idea, but we're in hundreds of millions or billions. So the banks are already up that learning curve. They have a scale economy advantage. They're more efficient, less costly at opening up envelopes and depositing checks than as a credit card company. A credit card company's special skill is negotiating deals with retailers and creating marketing campaigns that sucker you into signing up for things with a high APY. They're not particularly skilled at opening envelopes and scanning checks, so they outsource that activity to a bank. So the lockbox, it's actually a bank renting out its services to the credit card company. Are there any lockboxes of this sort anywhere around here? Yes. PNC's operations center is located right here in this city. It is effectively like a factory. At one time, there were factories that made a lot of steel. Right now, we've got a factory that opens up envelopes and deposits checks, and PNC runs a very large one of those right here in the city of Pittsburgh. So that's literally where the lockbox comes from. Okay, so that's the problem. And I guess the specifications of it are here. These are the lockboxes that we can rent. So the bank in Denver would charge us $30,000. The bank in Chicago would cost us $35,000, would charge us $35,000. And you might notice this is like a fixed cost. There's no variable cost. That's not realistic. But why did Ragsdale omit the variable cost? Implicitly, it's because it's the same everywhere. If it's like a penny per envelope at any one of these, you don't need to include that in your objective function because every envelope is going to get opened. So realistically, there's variable cost. The fact that Ragsdale didn't include it is really just means they're the same everywhere, so we don't need to worry about it. And then these are the data on float time, like how long a check is in the mail. If it goes from customers in the central region to Chicago, it's only 2 days. But if we try to mail something from the Southwest to New York City, that takes a full week. And then this is the volume of checks that are being written from our customers that are in each of those locations. Okay. Everybody understand the business problem we're trying to solve? What are the decision variables that we need for this problem? What does this problem feel like or remind you of? And what does that say about the decision variables? Double subscripted. Why do we need double subscripted?
From region A to logbox, region I to logbox J.
Yeah, exactly. We're making this connection between regions and lockboxes. So we need double subscripted. What exactly will the decision variable stand for? This is a little bit tricky. So one answer that you're tempted to go with is the number of checks or the dollar value. That's very rent-a-dent-like. But we don't actually have to worry about that because there are no capacity constraints here. The US Postal Service doesn't have a limit on how many envelopes it can carry from one point to another. And all of these lockboxes, they have no particular capacity constraint, which is to say, the number of checks that the credit card company is going to come to them with is just not that big compared to the number of checks the bank is processing anyhow. So we can let these variables be binary. We can just say region I is connected to lockbox J, yes, no. But if you started solving the problem with Xij, the amount of the connection, that's totally understandable and fine. But it'll turn out we just need yes, no, is this association made? Are there any other decision variables that we need in this problem? I mean, right now, the objective function would be sort of minimize the sum over all ij combinations. The distance from I to j, or maybe I should use time, but it's, you know, the thing that's up on the screen right now, times the value per day of checks from region I times, I guess I'll make them x's, times these binary decision variables that indicate yes, no, are we sending checks from region I to destination J? But Jenna said at the very beginning, there were two considerations we're balancing here. What's the other cost that's in the mix? Yeah, we got the cost of the lock boxes. So we're going to add that. How are we going to represent that? We're going to sum over lock boxes. And the costs of those lock boxes are up there. Let's just, I don't know, call it OJ for operating cost for lockbox J. That's a yellow cell, but we got to multiply it by blue or else it's just a constant. What we multiply it by is a binary indicator variable. Yes, no, are we renting that lockbox? Right? So let me slow down and fill in the definitions of the variables because that's important. Let Xij be a binary decision variable indicating whether region I's customers mail to lockbox J. And then the Yj, I'll do it this way so that you see it done in different ways. One, if we operate, or maybe I should say rent, because we don't actually operate, lockbox J, and 0 otherwise. That's the full objective function. If we have no constraints, just all the x's and y's are all going to be 0. So what are the other constraints that we need to add?
Well, I had a question. Can Yj be derived from Xij?
Well, they're going to be related. How are they related?
Well, you can't have people mail letters to a lockbox you don't operate.
So how are we going to do that? If we go back to transportation problem thinking, if we sum over all of the regions I that mail stuff to lockbox J, we're going to set that less than or equal to big M, which you learned about in the asynchronous lecture, times Yj. That's the connection between the X's and the Y's right over here for you guys. For all lockboxes J, if we add up across all the regions, a count of the number of regions mailing checks to that lockbox, that's less than or equal to big M times Yj. This is what forces us to pay the fixed cost of lockbox J if we're mailing checks there. If we're mailing checks to that lockbox from any region, this constraint flips the binary YJ up to being 1, because no matter what M is, if YJ is 0, M times 0 is 0. And the only way this left-hand side could be less than or equal to 0 is if all those X's are 0, i.e. no region is assigned to that lockbox.
For our lockbox assumption, do we assume that if we are getting from any like single check from one region or from every region, the cost would be the same, or would it increase as the?
That is the statement in the problem, is that there's a fixed cost of having a lockbox, no variable cost. And that's what I tried to explain earlier. Is it realistic that there's no variable cost? Absolutely not. But my inference is the variable cost is the same at every lockbox. So then we don't worry about it. If you've got 1 million checks that need to be deposited, we're going to deposit 1 million checks. There's no way we're going to just not deposit a check. So if the variable costs are the same in all the regions, there's no need to explicitly include it. How big does big M have to be?
That's it.
7. The big M in this case doesn't have to be all that big, right? There's only 7 regions. So the largest the left-hand side could ever be is 7, because I'm adding up 7 things that are 0 or 1. So big M does not have to be a very, very big number in this case.
For the value variable, the VI, is that the average daily payments by region, or is that?
Exactly correct.
Okay.
Yep, that's exactly correct. So both of these are yellow. And when you multiply yellow times yellow, it's yellow. So it's still a linear function. So what is this idea here? That's that idea of fixed costs that you learned about in the asynchronous lecture you watched today, which is one of the super important concepts in this chapter. And then the other constraint that we need is, so that's summing over I. We also are going to sum over J, Xij equals 1 for all I. What does that constraint mean?
Can't build more than one.
It's not a can't build more than one. This says for all regions I.
Each region can have.
Yeah, we're gonna serve the region. We're gonna collect those checks. It'd be a very bad solution if you went to the boss and said, I know how to collect the checks from half the country, but the other half we're just gonna throw in the trash. So this makes sure that all of the checks have a lockbox to go to. And let me just show you what this looks like in, I don't want you to have to watch me build the spreadsheet. That's not a good use of time once we've talked about it as much as we have. So this is a spreadsheet that captures it. Yellow is just the parameters of the problem. These are the Xijs. I've already run it to optimality. These e to the minus things are really effectively zeros. Probably should have already retyped them as zeros. And so this solution says build, quote unquote, lockboxes in Dallas and New York. Doesn't mean literally build. We're gonna rent the services of a bank in Dallas, and we're gonna rent the services of a bank in New York. Our customers who are in the central, Midwest, Northwest, Southeast, and Southwest are gonna mail the checks to Dallas. Our customers in the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast region are gonna mail the checks to New York. What is gonna be the total cost of that? Well, it's really ugly. There are 2 sum products in that expression. One is the sum product of yes, no, are we gonna operate the lockbox times the row of the cost of the lockboxes. Then the other part of the cost is 15%, our annual cost of capital, times the amount of money that is out there floating. And how do you figure out the amount that's floating? Well, these numbers are how much would be floating if we, or the cost of the floating, if we made that IJ connection. It is multiplying together the D and the V. In fact, if you look carefully, it's got not only the D and the V I left out, there's supposed to be a constant of 15% there. I forgot the 15%. And then in this, which is hard to read, I have some product, the XIJs with this to pick out. I'm only paying for the IJ combinations that I actually made. So that's the basic design of the spreadsheet, and you can see the big M is 7. So this row here is that, sum over I Xij. This row is the row of YJs, and this row is M times YJ, M just being 7 in this case. As you learned in the asynchronous lecture, you just make M big enough that it doesn't constrain the problem. And you make life a little bit easier on the computer if you choose sort of the smallest constant that doesn't intrude an artificial constraint. Two more little points. One is, how does the credit card company get people to cooperate? I mean, from my perspective, if I'm living in the Southwest, I'd much rather mail my check to New York because I don't want my check to get deposited quickly. So we would like it to turn out this way, but how do they get us to cooperate?
Late fees.
I mean, that's actually part of the story, right? Because they probably charge the late fee based on when it gets there. But there are some people who don't wait until the last possible minute. They would write the check basically when the bill arrived.
You pay through the bank?
Well, this whole problem has changed because of that. Let's get there in 1 second. If you get in the mail a piece of paper that says, pay this bill, do they ever print the address to which it should be mailed on that slip of paper that you put into the envelope with a little clear window? Right, have you ever seen that?
Yeah.
Envelope, clear window, you slide it in the right way, the address fits in the window. Aren't they really sweet and nice to save us the effort of having to? No, that is how they control you and get you to mail it to the lockbox that is close. Now let's come back to this. Did banks and other financial institutions invest billions of dollars in setting up electronic payment systems? They certainly did. Was that because they're nice and sweet and wanted to save you from having to buy a stamp? No, they wanted your money as quickly as possible. So they gave you the convenience of automatic electronic deposit. Now, it is in fact also better for them because it is easier to just accept an electronic payment than to open up the envelope. But unambiguously, they also like the fact that 1 millisecond after you, in effect, press return on your computer, they already have that money and they're able to use that money. So the modern approach is they don't actually really want you to put a check in the mail. They would prefer you to do electronic. But I still like the problem because it's a great example of the fixed cost ideas that you learned. Here's a little trick or twist that there's no way I would have expected you guys to realize. But if you squint really hard, you'll see that in the constraint list there, it says the Y's in row 27 must be binary. But nowhere did I say that the X's have to be binary. And yet they turned out to be binary. I mean, I understand that a few of them showed up as e to the minus 11th, but they're still effectively binary. How did I get away with that? Because that was really helpful for the computer. It's much better for the computer to have 7 binary variables than to have had 56 binary variables.
Isn't it the combination of the constraints working together that kind of compels the X's to also be binary?
Yeah. But we can be a little bit more specific. You could say, it's magic. It's the magic theorem. Basically, every time this thing goes to solve the LP relaxation and the branch and bound, every one of those is going to end up being a straight transshipment problem. So when we fork on any of the Y's, the round down and round up are going to be 0 or 1. And then that's going to leave us with just a transshipment problem. And because that is a transshipment problem, the magic theorem implies that all the X's will come out integer. All right. Removing snow in Montreal. This is the world's easiest question. What is going on in the removing snow in Montreal case? We're removing snow. What is different about dealing with snow in Montreal compared to Pittsburgh? And don't say they actually do it. We're in Pittsburgh, we don't. But in cities at this latitude that are well managed, how do we deal with snow? We just plow it to the side of the road and wait for it to melt. In a city that's further north, like Montreal, or where I hang out, Calgary, what happens if you just try pushing the snow off to the side of the road? It's like there for 4 months. And so in a far northern city, you might initially push it to the side of the road, but then you got to go back with all these front end loaders and scoop it up and put it in a dump truck, and the dump truck has to take it off someplace. You can't just wait for a melt. And so that's the problem that's being faced in Montreal. And the data for this case are, we have places that we can take the snow, and we have the city divided up into sectors. And this is basically the amount of snow that falls in those sectors driven by the size of the sector. And these are the distances. And the cost is sort of per ton of snow per mile, or I guess it's per 1,000 cubic meters of snow per mile. And then the other thing that's in the case is limits on how much, oh yeah, they're right there. The limits on how much snow can be taken to each disposal site. Where do these limits come from? One possibility is just literally physical size limit. If the location is like a giant parking lot where festivals are held in the summer, there's just so and so much snow that you can put there before you run out of physical space. But the more common, or another kind of limit that's referred to in the case, is you got to read these cases more carefully. I mean, the whole point of being in this class instead of straight management math classes, so you have the chance to think about the real world and the management implications. But either because of physical size or environmental restrictions. So the concept here is the snow is dirty. It falls on the street, it absorbs some of the oil and the gas and the rubber that's sitting on the street. You scoop it up, and or it has been treated with salt. And so this is not just clean frozen water. And a lot of the disposal sites are not like a surface parking lot. A lot of disposal sites are like a gully or a ravine with a creek running through it, and you dump it into the creek or the ravine. And the physical size of that ravine might be very, very large, but then when it melts, you can't have too much salt and too much toxins relative to the flow of that water, or else it will harm the fish and the amphibians that live in that spot. So that's the other place that you get constraints. What are the decision variables for this problem? How many subscripts should we have? Yeah, this is a 2 subscript problem. This is very much a transportation type problem. And so back in chapter 3, I think it was, we had basically the same case. We didn't go over it, but there the decision variables were Xij, the amount of snow from sector I that gets taken to disposal site J, sum over, for all J, sum over I, the amount delivered must be less than or equal to the disposal site capacity. And conversely, summing over J, that has to add up to the total amount of snow in sector I. We've got to deal with all the snow, min cost. Why? But this is now chapter 6. How does this become a chapter 6 problem?
We're trying to, since it costs a certain amount to transport the stuff, the snow, we're trying to make it as fair as possible for each sector.
Nope.
No.
I mean, I didn't see that when I read it.
I thought I saw it, maybe not.
Sorry. I don't remember where the line is. Here it is. For contractual reasons, each sector may be assigned to only a single disposal site. So it's not a physical thing, it's a, we're subcontracting this work out to a bunch of private companies. And the way that we write contracts are, your company is responsible for Squirrel Hill, your company is responsible for Shady Side. We don't want to be in the situation that we're out there trying to measure how much each of you take away in your dump trucks. That would just be a burdensome thing. So we're going to do it sector by sector. So what's the formulation for the problem going to be? So it's minimize sum over all ij, that distance from I to j times the amount of snow in sector I times that binary decision variable saying yes, no, it's assigned to disposal site j or not. For all sectors I, summing over j, xij is equal to 1. Some contractor has to be responsible for getting rid of the snow at all of the sites. And for all disposal sites, summing over the sectors that can send them snow, the amount of snow that is sent has to be less than or equal to the capacity of site J. And the xij are binary. So in some respects, this is very similar, and it's actually simpler than the previous problem because we don't have the CJ times the YJ. We don't have to pay the fixed cost to use the disposal site. Questions about that? I'm pretty sure I put up on Canvas a little real world aside about this problem. What is the real challenge for the mayor of Montreal in trying to deal with this? I mean, yes, they have to solve this optimization problem. The real challenge is that the snow disposal sector, I shouldn't say sector because sector means something else here. The snow disposal business is mobbed up. It is seriously involved with organized crime, corrupt, and actually fairly violent. And there is non-trivial amounts of violence that is done when your company tries to compete by offering a lower bid on territory that this company used to operate. Mostly the violence takes the form of spiking the equipment, not breaking the legs of the drivers. But yeah, they have a real corruption / organized crime dimension on top of the straight logistics problem that they have to deal with getting rid of their snow in Montreal. It's like, I think everything in Canada is perfect, and it's really pretty nice, but the other city in Canada, I mean, are any of you Canadian? So the other city that has a real problem with this is Toronto, but in Toronto, it's the towing disabled vehicles racket. So the city contracts out to tow truck companies to remove disabled vehicles from highways to avoid creating congestion. Those are relatively lucrative contracts, and in part because they use violence to intimidate anybody else out of bidding for them, and then they can get their bid through at a high price. And yeah, it can actually be kind of rough if you end up. So all of you who want to go into city management, there's a small dose of reality. Okay, the next one, I don't remember what I said about whether you were supposed to read this one, so I will get you off the hook on summarizing it and just explain this power dispatching problem. It's a very cool problem for us pedagogically. It's a stretch problem a little bit. This would be beyond what I would think would be reasonable for you to do as a homework problem. But that's good. And also, you know, it relates to the energy environment that many of you all are interested in. And so I like to use it for that reason too. So electricity, as I think you understand, cannot easily be stored in the form of electricity. And demand for electricity varies a lot. We already talked about that with some of the gas problems, basically mostly because of weather and time of day. And that means you have to produce at any given moment the amount of electricity that is needed right then. You can't store it. And it turns out to be difficult for many plants to just ramp up and ramp down how much you are producing. So there's a whole set of plants, technologies that have very low marginal production cost, but they have very, very little ability to go up and down how much they produce. And that is primarily nuclear and also coal. So you typically run those plants just 24/7, and you set that electricity production capacity to be equal to whatever is the minimum of the variation over time and how much of electricity you need. And then you've got another whole set of plant technologies that do have the ability to go up and down in how much they produce. The best in that regard is probably pumped storage hydro and natural gas. Oil is sort of in between in that regard. Oh, and by the way, the right way to think about this is not actually demand. This is demand net of what is being produced by wind and solar. Because the wind and solar are also going to go up and down, and their marginal cost is effectively zero. So you definitely want to use those if you can. But what remains as variable is demand less what you're producing with wind and solar. So that's what we're trying to address here. And the cost structure of these plants has three components. One is the marginal cost, and you can think about that as essentially the fuel cost. How much is the cost of the hydrocarbons that you're burning in order to generate the steam that turns the turbines that creates the electricity? And you can see those are 5, 4, and 7 per megawatt. But there's also a fixed cost of having the plant operating at all. That's not the amortized capital cost of building it. That is a cost that you pay when the plant is turned on, separate from the financing cost. But then there's, in addition to that, often a very large cost of turning the plant on at all. So you would you would have a different problem if all you had was the fixed cost and the variable cost. Because you would then, when you got the chance, turn the plant off completely. But if you turn the plant off completely, then you have to do a restart, and restarts are very expensive. Why do you think restarts are so expensive? How many of you have like toured power plants? You're all interested in the energy area, you should spend time, they're fascinating beasts. So one part of it is you just have to burn some fuel in order to heat up your steam and get the thing ready to go. But the bigger problem is plants are hot. And metal doesn't really like to go from cold to hot to cold to hot to cold to hot very often. That creates metal fatigue. And so you have a certain number of times that you can change the temperature from cold to hot before you're going to have to replace turbine blades or do other maintenance. So we would much prefer to have a plant just always on than to be constantly turning it on and off, running it over those temperature changes. All right. So here's the problem. We have a forecast over time of how much we need to produce. And these are the peaking plants that we have available in their different capacities. So if we ran them all at full capacity, we'd have 7,000. That's plenty. So we have enough capacity. We'll meet this demand, but we want to do it at the lowest possible cost. That makes sense? What decision variables do we need? Now, how many subscripts? You're the stars today. How many subscripts? Yeah, we have 2 subscripts because I is going to subscript the plant, J is going to subscript the day. And by the way, in the real world, they don't do it by the day, they do it by 15-minute block of time. So the real problem would be 7 times 24 times 4 of these. Ragsdale just makes them smaller so they fit on a page, but it's the same basic setup, just more variables. Yeah, so we want double subscripted decision variables. The most obvious one is Xij is the amount of electricity produced by plant I on day J. And clearly one of the constraints is going to be for every day J, summing over the plant's I, Xij must be greater than or equal to the demand for electricity on day J. I guess actually I should use L, load. Right, so Lj is that set of numbers up on top. That's how much electricity we have to produce for every day J, summing over the plants, the amount of electricity we produce has to meet that demand. And in the objective function, my board management here is really lousy. I guess I'll put it here. The objective function is certainly going to have a summation over I and a summation over J with a piece here that is the variable cost of plant I times Xij. So variable cost I is the 5, 4, or 7. So far, this just looks like a transportation problem pretty much, but that's not enough. How are we going to get the fixed costs in? How do we get the 200, 300, and 250 in?
A binary of whether or not they're on or not.
Yep. So Yij equals 1 if we operate plant I on day J. So then we can add plus the fixed cost of plant I times Yij. That summation covers both of those terms. Good. If I run solver right now, what will make the values of the y's? That'll make them all 0. How do we keep solver from making y 0 when they're not allowed to be 0? That's the fixed cost trick from the asynchronous lecture. Xij less than or equal to big M times Yij. That's the trick you learned about from the lecture. So if Xij is positive, it will force the corresponding Yij to flip up from 0 to 1, and we'll have to pay that cost. So if Xij is 0, Yij will be 0 because the cost minimization pressure of the objective function will prefer to make the Y be 0. But if the X is any positive number, its corresponding Y is going to be forced equal to 1. What is a good value to use for the big M? We might as well just make it the maximum generating capacity of plant I, because we would need otherwise to have the constraint Xij less than or equal to the capacity of plant I. We've got that constraint anyhow. So this kind of does two things at once. This is first of all saying Xij is less than or equal to the generating capacity of that plant. And simultaneously, it's also enforcing that logic. If you have X positive, then we're going to force the Y to be 1. So it's 2 for the price of 1. All right. Excellent. But we still haven't accounted for the 800, the 1,000, and the 700. So we'll just add Zij, which is equal to 1 if we turn plant I on Jj. That's a horribly awful way of writing an English sentence. So if we turn plant I on Jj, then we have to add that what? Sorry?
If we turn on plant I.
On Jj.
No, as in like, you would say turn on.
Oh, brilliant. I is an engineer. I don't know English. And then we can add in, what's a good acronym here? Startup cost. The startup cost of plant I times Zij. And so the closed parentheses, because the summation applies over all 3 of these terms. 3 kinds of costs. You've got the variable cost, the fixed cost, and the turn on the plant cost. If I stop now, what will solver make all of the Z's? Just make them all 0. So I need to have a constraint to make the Z's behave themselves. And this is the piece of this that is, I think, tricky at this level for you guys to figure out. But at the same time, that's why I kind of like doing this case.
That J minus 1.
Correct. The subscript here is yesterday. We cannot tell solver that we are operating this plant on today unless either it was operating yesterday or we admit that we just turned it on. And so we're going to have to pay that startup cost. And for you guys over here, we are not allowed to say this plant is on this day, and hence we can use it to produce electricity unless either it was on yesterday or we turned it on today. And if we turn it on today, then we're going to end up being charged the appropriate cost. The meta story in chapter 6 is we can model all kinds of things that we weren't able to model before. Capital budgeting problems are also super cool. I may on Tuesday do one more capital budgeting problem to review those also, since we don't have recitation tomorrow. But what I hope you get a flavor for is there are all kinds of areas in the real world where bringing optimization to the table allows us to address real and practical concerns that you might have been able to kind of figure out with a pencil and paper at this size, but the real size problems are going to be, there are 30 different peaking plants out there, and we are having forecasts not for 7 days, but every 15-minute chunk over 24 hours over 7 days. At that point, it's just too much to wing it. And so we can do that operational optimization with the sort of tools that we're covering in this class. Good luck tomorrow. I hope it goes well.